Okay, hi, I'm Everin. I use he, him pronouns. As said, I co-host an anti-fascist, anti-TERF analysis podcast, and I spend most of my time working with Queer Care, which is an autonomous trans-feminist community care and support organization. I basically spend the majority of my time trying to tactically outsmart TERFs and the state, though of course recently the crossover and complete meshing of the two has made that a little difficult. First up, a clarification. I don't want to argue about the correct definition of what a TERF is. So when I use this term, I do so to distinguish between radicalized trans-exterminatory gender reactionaries of all kind of tendencies, as opposed to general bigots. So listeners may or may not know about the concept of Gillick competency. But a précis is that it is a British legal measurement of a patient's ability to determine their own healthcare needs, regardless of age, but in terms of capacity. Gillick competency was recently attacked by TERFs because they have a fascist conception of the child as a sacrosanct figure, which is perpetually vulnerable and requires authoritarian influence to protect it. This is obviously a self-centered philosophy of control, and when visited upon real children, rapidly becomes politically abusive. A warped version of it is applied to transmasculine people who are perpetually infantilized, with 1980s-style pro-family TERF groups rallying around a fictional deluge of autistic lesbians who need saving from the trans agenda. Other reactionaries, of course, support this to further their own agendas. Eugenicist, anti-intersex, ableist, anti-feminist kind of stuff from TERFs to general fash. The TERF success with the rhetoric came in the form of the recent Kira Bell ruling that undermined the Gillick concept greatly, which has already had far-reaching consequences for more than just trans youth, which the case was ostensibly about. Kira Bell is a detransitioner who argued that, script's on. Kira Bell was a detransitioner who argued that she wasn't competent to receive care along these exact same lines. So I won't go into detail about how much TERF ability to enact political violence has grown over the past year and the few months alone, but this exterminatory vision of the TERFs has become far better realized recently. They agitate in favor of conversion therapy. They organize child abuse via the medical and psychiatric professions, with this endgame being total trans extermination. It's notable that these components are imports from the Christian right, mainly. Prior to their emergence as the key influential basis for modern transphobic politics, TERFs were relatively more confined to the academy, which is not to say that transphobia was invented by Raymond and Greer, but that a few years ago, this state interference in trans lives was kind of dismissed as irrational scaremongering when people predicted the possibility of what's happening right now. I cover this in more detail in episodes of the podcast I do, so I won't exhaustively rerun it here and test people's patience. But the concepts I'm speaking on here pop up there, and I think our first episode about this specific fascistic obsession with the child is also relevant. Much of my thoughts are also in relation to writers such as Edelman, Perlman, and Baden, don't know if I'm pronouncing those right, who I recommend people look at if they haven't already. In my view, this control obsession around the child myth comes from this liberal to right view of the family as one of production, or children of possessions. Trans people's genders don't need validation from the state, as our continued existence despite all of this shows. And so the anxiety is completely understandable once you realize exactly what the priorities and fears of these gender reactionaries are. Once you treat TERFs as a weirdly gender-cranked version of any other fascist, not only do you actually take the concerns of trans people seriously, you realize why they're like this and how to counter them. Treating them just as like trans exclusionary is why, in my opinion, cis liberals and leftists have kind of wasted the last 5 years either ignoring TERFs or engaging with them selfishly for clout. In reality, the situation is more complex, as can be gleaned from a quick glance at leading culture warriors on the right. For example, Liz Truss has made repeated statements utilizing the same bullshit, which serve to enhance the Tory soft power methods of furthering their general reactionary agenda. Another great example of this is the use of American oil lobby-style revolving doors between elite levels of government, media institutions like the BBC. This combines with their willingness to onboard eugenicist cranks, evangelical turbo-Reagan pressure groups, and random TERFs in order to ban feminism, LGBT people generally, and anti-racism. This links in with the Tories' other social policies, such as educational reforms that focus on banning discussion of anti-capitalism, anti-racism, and again, trans people in schools. It's kind of like Prevent meets Section 28, but bigger and for every progressive issue. This introduces an active measure of surveillance state apparatus into all trans lives as well. It's clear looking back that the government's strategy is to stoke this cultural bullshit on minorities, both as a scapegoat and as a distraction. They can keep the mush brain reactionaries on the former, and then, as they've done now, can discard the scapegoat in order to appease Middle England, which is especially prudent considering the pressing matter of COVID and the state's responsibilities to handle Brexit. On the non-governmental side, the bill case has laid a minefield for anyone under 18 trying to access healthcare and made it more difficult for trans people across the board. This leads us to contemplate a grim reality. We have to realize that all of our truly radical institutions right now are kind of either microscopic or were destroyed years ago. What we have to work with is a mixture of tepid NGOs and smaller organizations. This is the result of decades of selective pressure. Accordingly, we attempt to enact these radical liberationary politics within the surviving institutions, which are inadequate due to this exact selective pressure for conservatism, whether that's police harassment, councils being bound by no recourse to public fund orders, Tory charity gag orders, etc. This has become so extreme that many ostensibly good organizations are no longer fit for purpose, a fact that has been exacerbated by the institutional influence of veteran transphobic leftists. To add to that, 2020 burnout has led to a situation where citizen leftists have kind of just logged off. As a result, trans people often find themselves in a position where they're looking around, seeing the latest horrifying news, seeing all of their trans friends in similar states of panic, but only see basic, vague commentary from cis allies at best, like, Owen Jones solidarity tweets. Because we face a range of forces that are all converging against us, we need to think practically about how our enemy is constituted. We're basically looking at a headless alliance. Even if all the bits of the beast don't agree with or coordinate with each other, the efforts are ultimately directed at one center, maintaining hegemony over society via the means of violent control over marginalized bodies. As the essay The Stagnant Tide by Dick Allen Theodore argues, TERFs emerged from the primordial soup of Middle England's anxieties. We demand complex long-term care from a health system that Tories once sold for scrap. Our romances and lives threaten middle-class sensibilities with our degenerate ways, and our existence disrupts educational and administrative norms. A leaked TERF document literally shows their fear, motivated by our propensity to organize horizontally, engage in mutual aid, be in poverty or on benefits, that kind of stuff. This headless alliance from the grassroots to the front bench are terrified of these tendencies for the exact reason I think trans liberation and solidarity is necessary as part of a genuine left program. I think there's a few key points to hit and build infrastructure on. In terms of health activism, there's a lot of confusion and misinformation about what healthcare rights remain after this Bell ruling, and any person or organization who's hostile to trans lives is using this confusion to the fullest. GICs didn't have to immediately suspend healthcare for all under 18s in the wake of the court ruling, and yet that's exactly what they did. The usual suspects in the media are currently pushing this ruling as an excuse to argue for an entire ban on trans-affirming policy in schools. Leftists should be collecting, organizing, and sharing resources the state has made it clear that they will no longer provide. In case you don't know, the current average waiting time to be seen by a gender clinic is around 40 months for the first appointment and a few more years for treatment. Healthcare support can be organised in an affinity group or at a mutual aid and solidarity network level for trans and cis peers. Advocacy resources and training already exist. Putting these into place within a harm reduction, anti-psychiatric and anti-carceral context are essential to support those the state has already abandoned. Trans migrants, self-medders, sex workers, trans people of no fixed abode, and those not served by these existing NGO charity-style institutions. In terms of youth support, those who can should support youth-led initiatives like gendered intelligence and queer care. Those with children or with connections to schools should advocate in the face of this managed chaos for trans-affirming policies there. In terms of union and employment support, TERFs are now focusing on driving trans people out of another area of public life, employment. Again, they're using the same confusion, misinformation, and institutional access to their advantage. As I've researched and covered with Blood and Turf, trans hostile union professionals are unfortunately quite common. So I suggest anyone who is affiliated to Solnets or unions or any group or individual that does work as advocacy should aggressively promote their trans-friendly status and pursue trans workers' casework. I think organizing like this and viewing institutions in this way is important to avoid repeating the same losses as in the past. Existing as trans, doing any kind of activism and any kind of organizing are harder than ever. So replicating this solidarity will be both uplifting for your trans comrades, but also a way to inoculate against the conservatism displayed by a leftism in retreat after a decade of austerity, a year of COVID, and in the face of Brexit.